This isn't in the books, but it should be. If you like what I do here, consider subscribing. Low light, open mind, silence within. Berlin, 1898. A laboratory bathed in gaslight and ambition. Glass vials lined shelves where chemists believed they could perfect nature, strip danger from relief, turn suffering into profit without consequence. They called their creation heroic. They printed the name on bottles sent to 23 countries before a single long-term study had been completed. Heroin, the miracle that would cure morphine addiction. Silence the cough that plagued the working class. Ease pain without the messy side effects that made morphine inconvenient. The world believed because the world was desperate. And desperation has always been the most effective marketing strategy ever devised. But miracles don't leave this many bodies behind. They don't create epidemics that span centuries, don't build empires in shadows, don't turn medicine into crime and crime into multinational operations more efficient than most governments. What began in that Berlin lab wasn't salvation. It was the first domino in a collapse that hasn't stopped falling. From pharmaceutical companies to criminal cartels, from Civil War battlefields to suburban pharmacies, from opium fields hidden in mountains to synthetic compounds made in labs that require hazmat suits. This is the story of how humanity's quest to eliminate pain created suffering on a scale no war ever accomplished. The truth was always there, in medical journals, in classified reports, in the shaking hands of people whose bodies told stories that policy refused to hear. But truth has a way of getting erased when profit depends on its silence, when systems are built on foundations too corrupt to acknowledge, when admitting the problem would require confronting uncomfortable questions about who we protect and who we sacrifice. This isn't just history, it's a wound that never healed, a lie that keeps regenerating with new chemicals and familiar promises. And tonight, in the quiet of your attention, that wound opens again, not to shock, not to entertain, but to reveal what was always hidden in plain sight. The miracle was never real, but the consequences, those were always going to last forever. In 1898, a German laboratory unveiled what they called salvation in powder form. Doctors praised it, mothers trusted it, children swallowed it without question. The world called it a miracle, a cure for suffering itself. But miracles don't leave wounds this deep. And this one was never what it seemed. The advertisements spread like gospel across Europe and America, printed in languages the illiterate couldn't read but believed anyway. Non-addictive, the labels promised. Safe for children, the physicians declared. Heroin, the name itself meant heroic, powerful, divine. It was marketed as the answer to morphine addiction, the solution to tuberculosis, the remedy for a cough that wouldn't quit. And for a brief, terrifying moment, the entire world believed the lie. Nobody questioned what couldn't be seen yet. Nobody imagined what was already growing in the blood. Bayer didn't invent addiction, they just gave it a name people could trust. The company that brought aspirin to millions now offered something stronger, something that dissolved pain and replaced it with a warmth that felt like love. Pharmacies stocked it beside cough syrup. Doctors prescribed it to factory workers, war veterans, pregnant women. The drug didn't discriminate. It embraced everyone equally. And in that embrace, it erased the line between medicine and dependency. The truth was hidden in plain sight, printed on bottles no one thought to doubt. What made heroin different wasn't its chemistry, it was its timing. The world was tired. The Industrial Revolution had broken bodies faster than medicine could mend them. Wars had left men hollowed out, searching for anything to fill the void. Heroin arrived not as a drug, but as an answer. It silenced the questions people were too exhausted to ask. It numbed the wounds society refused to acknowledge. And in doing so, it became the first pharmaceutical deception to operate on a global scale. The collapse wouldn't come for years, but the foundation was already cracking. By the time the world realized what had been unleashed, the damage was already generational. Children raised on heroin-laced cough syrup became adults who couldn't function without it. Soldiers returned home, addicted to the very medicine meant to heal them. And Bayer? They moved on, quietly, without apology. The miracle had been classified as a mistake, but the mistake had already spread too far to contain. What came next wasn't an accident. It was an operation, one that would reshape addiction, policy, and power for the next century. And it all started with a lie wrapped in a promise no one should have believed. The lie didn't start with malice. It started with ignorance dressed as progress. Bayer's chemists believed they'd perfected morphine, stripped it of its dangers, turned suffering into something manageable. They tested it on factory workers first, then on themselves. The results seemed miraculous. Coughs vanished, pain dissolved. And the subjects? They felt better than better. They felt invincible. Nobody measured what was happening beneath the skin. Nobody tracked the silent operation unfolding in the bloodstream, where dependency was already writing itself into the body's code. The word non-addictive appeared in medical journals across 3 continents before a single long-term study had been completed. Doctors cited each other's optimism as evidence. Pharmaceutical reps handed out free samples like communion wafers. The drug moved faster than science could follow. And why wouldn't it? Morphine addiction had become a crisis, and here was a solution that required no withdrawal, no suffering, no messy ethical questions. Heroin promised a clean exit from the very problem it would soon multiply. The truth was hidden not in secrecy, but in collective enthusiasm. Nobody wanted to look too closely at what they desperately needed to believe. By 1899, heroin was being shipped to 23 countries. It arrived in pharmacies, hospitals, and private clinics with the Bayer logo stamped on every vial. The marketing was brilliant in its simplicity. This wasn't a drug, it was medicine. This wasn't addiction, it was treatment. The language mattered. It always does. When you call something a cure, people stop asking if it might be a wound in disguise, and heroin wore its disguise well. It came in clean glass bottles, prescribed by men in white coats, endorsed by institutions people had been taught to trust. The deception wasn't just chemical, it was cultural, it was systemic, it was complete. The first cracks appeared not in laboratories, but in living rooms. Mothers noticed their children couldn't sleep without the syrup. Factory workers started doubling their doses just to feel normal. Veterans who'd been prescribed heroin for war injuries found themselves unable to stop, even after the pain had long since faded. But these weren't classified as problems yet. They were anomalies, outliers, individual failures of character, not a collective failure of science. The truth was being silenced not by conspiracy, but by cognitive dissonance. The world had invested too much belief in the miracle to admit it had been deceived. And so the lie continued, not because it was hidden, but because it was easier to repeat than to question. What made this deception global wasn't just Bayer's reach, it was the wound it filled. Every nation had its suffering, industrial accidents, wartime casualties, diseases that turned bodies into prisons of pain. Heroin offered escape, and escape, when marketed as medicine, becomes irresistible. The collapse of trust would come later, once the bodies piled high enough to be undeniable. But in those early years, the lie thrived precisely because it was believed. The greatest deceptions don't require silence. They require just enough truth to make the falsehood invisible. And heroin? It had just enough truth to erase the questions that might have saved millions. Heinrich Drieser wasn't trying to build an empire. He was trying to solve a problem. As Bayer's head pharmacologist, his job was simple: find something better than morphine, something that killed pain without the chains. In 1897, he synthesized diacetylmorphine in a Berlin lab, watched it work on animals, then on employees who volunteered their bodies to science. The results stunned him. It was stronger, faster, cleaner. He called it heroin, from the German heroisch, heroic. He thought he'd created medicine. He'd created something far more dangerous. He'd created desire in molecular form. Dresser didn't understand addiction the way we do now. Nobody did. The science didn't exist yet. What he saw was efficacy. What he measured was relief. Heroin suppressed coughs better than codeine. It eased pain better than morphine. And unlike morphine, it seemed to produce less sedation, less nausea, less of the side effects that made patients uncomfortable. On paper, it looked perfect. In practice, it was perfect, for exactly the wrong reasons. The drug didn't just relieve suffering. It erased it so completely that the body forgot how to function without it. But that truth remained hidden in the biology, invisible to instruments that could only measure what happened in the moment, not what would collapse years later. Bayer moved quickly, too quickly. Within months, heroin was being mass-produced and shipped worldwide. Drieser published papers praising its safety. Company representatives visited hospitals, handed out samples, gave lectures to medical societies. The operation wasn't covert, it was celebrated. Heroin became a bestseller not through deception, but through genuine belief that it was progress. And in a way, it was. It worked exactly as intended. The problem was that nobody had asked the right question. What happens when the miracle doesn't stop? What happens when the body rewrites itself around the chemical? What happens when the cure becomes the wound? The irony is that Dresser did notice something strange. Some patients began requesting higher doses. Some reported feeling ill when they stopped taking it, but these observations were dismissed as outliers, not patterns. The medical community wasn't equipped to recognize addiction as a physiological process yet. It was still seen as a moral failing, a weakness of character. So when heroin produced dependency, it wasn't blamed on the drug, it was blamed on the patient. This cognitive gap allowed the lie to persist longer than it should have. Dresser remained convinced until his death that heroin was one of his greatest contributions to medicine. He never lived to see the full scope of what he'd unleashed. The truth was, silenced not by him, but by the limitations of his era's understanding. What made Drieser an accidental mastermind wasn't genius, it was timing. He created the perfect drug at the perfect moment, when the world was desperate, when science was trusted without question, when regulatory systems didn't exist to slow the momentum. Heroin filled a void before anyone realized the void would become a chasm. And by the time the classified reports started appearing, the ones documenting widespread addiction, the ones revealing the scale of the crisis, it was already too late. The drug had embedded itself into medical practice, into cultural habit, into the architecture of global commerce. Drieser had built something that couldn't be unbuilt. And somewhere, in the margins of history, the first domino had already begun to fall. The birth of heroin wasn't dramatic. There were no explosions, No eureka moments shouted across laboratory halls. It happened quietly, methodically, in a sterile room where morphine molecules were chemically altered with acetic anhydride. The process was simple, too simple. Two acetyl groups attached to morphine structure, and suddenly the compound crossed the blood-brain barrier 3 times faster. It hit harder, it lingered longer, and it felt to those first test subjects like the answer to every question pain had ever asked. But answers this immediate always carry a hidden cost. This one would cost generations. What Heinrich Draeser and his team created wasn't just a drug. It was a template for every pharmaceutical disaster that would follow. Heroin proved that chemistry could outpace ethics, that profit could move faster than safety, that belief could override evidence. The compound was patented in 1898. By 1899, Bayer was producing a ton of it annually. A ton. Of a substance nobody fully understood, distributed to millions who trusted the name on the bottle more than the substance inside it. The operation was legal, celebrated, and catastrophic. And it all began with a single chemical modification that seemed at the time like progress. The drug's power lay not just in its chemistry, but in its invisibility. Heroin didn't announce itself as dangerous. It announced itself as relief. Patients took it for coughs and walked away feeling lighter, unburdened, briefly untouchable. Doctors prescribed it because it worked, and working was all that mattered in an era where pain management meant choosing between suffering and sedation. Heroin offered a third option: clarity without pain, function without suffering. It was the first drug to promise you could have both, and that promise, more than any marketing campaign, is what made it spread. The truth about what came after that clarity, the shaking, the sickness, the desperate need, that truth was erased from the conversation before it could even begin. The breakthrough became a domino, not because it was inherently evil, but because it was inherently effective. Heroin worked too well. It solved problems so completely that people stopped looking for alternatives. Why would they? The miracle was right there, in a small glass vial, affordable and accessible. And when the side effects started appearing, the addiction, the overdoses, the lives collapsing under the weight of dependency, there was no framework to understand them. Addiction wasn't yet medicalized, it was moralized. So the drug kept its reputation while the users lost theirs. The wound grew in silence, misdiagnosed as personal failure rather than systemic catastrophe. By the time governments began investigating, heroin had already woven itself into the fabric of daily life. It was in cough syrup given to children. It was in pain medication prescribed to the elderly. It was in the kits doctors carried to house calls. Removing it would mean admitting the entire medical establishment had been wrong, that the trusted institutions had failed, that the classified research suggesting danger had been ignored or suppressed. And so the domino stood, teetering for longer than it should have. When it finally fell, in the 1920s when bans began appearing, the damage was already generational. Heroin had taught the world a lesson it would spend the next century refusing to learn, that breakthroughs can become disasters when speed outpaces scrutiny. And somewhere, in the shadow of that first domino, another was already being positioned. The body doesn't lie. It can't. It records everything, every dose, every moment of relief, every promise the drug whispered into the bloodstream. By 1902, hospitals started noticing patterns they couldn't explain away. Patients who'd been prescribed heroin for minor ailments were returning weeks later, not for the original condition, but for the drug itself. They complained of sweating, tremors, an unnamed agony that had no medical classification yet. Doctors called it nervousness. They called it hysteria. They called it anything except what it was. The body unraveling the lie one symptom at a time. The truth was written in shaking hands and sleepless nights, but the world wasn't ready to read it. The first real evidence came from places nobody wanted to look: prisons, asylums, charity hospitals where the poor received treatment without the luxury of denial. Physicians working in these margins began documenting something disturbing. Patients who stopped taking heroin didn't just return to baseline. They collapsed. Violent illness, bone-deep pain, a desperation so complete it looked like madness. These reports were published in obscure medical journals, buried under more optimistic studies funded by pharmaceutical interests. The truth was technically public, but functionally hidden. It existed in footnotes, in the observations of doctors whose credibility was questioned because their patients weren't respectable enough to matter. The lie persisted because society had already decided which voices counted. What made the unraveling so slow wasn't lack of evidence. It was the wound the evidence would expose. Admitting heroin was addictive meant admitting the medical establishment had poisoned millions. It meant pharmaceutical companies would face consequences. It meant parents would have to confront what they'd given their children in good faith. The cognitive dissonance was too painful, so the truth got silenced through selective attention. Studies showing harm were labeled inconclusive. Doctors reporting addiction were accused of exaggeration. And the patients? They were blamed for their own suffering, as if moral weakness could explain a biological process that rewrote neural pathways. The body kept speaking. The world kept refusing to listen. By 1910, the lie was becoming impossible to maintain, but the systems built around it were too entrenched to dismantle quickly. Heroin sales were funding research departments. Medical schools were teaching its benefits. Entire supply chains depended on its production. The drug had become infrastructure, and infrastructure doesn't collapse from truth alone. It collapses from pressure, from accumulation, from the weight of consequences finally exceeding the capacity for denial. The bodies were piling up now, not just in margins, but in middle-class homes, in veterans' hospitals, in neighborhoods where addiction had no name, but everyone recognized its face. The classified reports governments were beginning to compile told a story of a miracle that had always been a mistake. But mistakes this big don't get admitted. They get managed. The body's testimony was undeniable by the time World War I ended. Soldiers returned home addicted to morphine and heroin, prescribed liberally on battlefields where survival mattered more than long-term consequences. Their withdrawal was public, visible, impossible to moralize away as personal failure. These were heroes after all. And if heroes could become addicted, maybe addiction wasn't about character. Maybe it was about chemistry. This realization didn't bring compassion. It brought panic. The operation to distance heroin from medicine began in earnest, not to save lives, but to save reputations. The drug that had been called heroic was now being erased from official pharmacy shelves, rebranded as the substance only criminals touched. The lie had been exposed, but the response to that exposure would create wounds far deeper than the drug itself ever could. Fast forward nearly a century. The heroin crisis had faded into historical footnote, a cautionary tale the medical industry promised never to repeat. Then came 1996. Purdue Pharma introduced OxyContin, a time-release oxycodone pill, marketed as safe, effective, and, here's where history stuttered, less addictive than previous opioids. The claim was based on the assumption that slow release meant less euphoria, And less euphoria meant less abuse potential. It was logical. It was scientific. It was completely, catastrophically wrong. The truth about addiction hadn't changed since Bayer's mistake. Only the marketing had gotten better. Purdue didn't stumble into this crisis. They engineered an operation so precise, it looked like healthcare. Sales representatives were trained to downplay addiction risks, armed with studies that cherry-picked data and ignored red flags. Doctors were wined and dined, flown to conferences, compensated for prescribing. Pain became the fifth vital sign, a marketing phrase that medicalized normal human discomfort into something requiring pharmaceutical intervention. And OxyContin. It was positioned as the solution to undertreated pain, a moral imperative wrapped in a pill. The drug spread through America like a remedy, but what it actually spread was dependency dressed as treatment. The wound was being carved before anyone realized they were bleeding. The trap was hidden in plain sight, buried in the language of compassion. Who could argue against treating pain? What kind of doctor would let a patient suffer when relief existed? Purdue exploited this ethical dilemma brilliantly. They turned prescription pads into delivery mechanisms for a crisis that would dwarf anything heroin had accomplished in its early years. Within 5 years, OxyContin prescriptions exceeded millions. Within 10, emergency rooms were flooded with overdoses. The drug worked exactly as intended. It killed pain. But it also rewired brains, turned housewives into addicts, transformed high school athletes into people who'd do anything for another pill. The classified internal documents would later reveal Purdue knew. They knew, and they continued. What made this trap different from Bayer's mistake was intent. Bayer had been ignorant. Purdue had history. They had decades of research on opioid addiction, regulatory frameworks, warnings from their own scientists. They pushed forward anyway because the profit margin was staggering. OxyContin generated over $35 billion before the reckoning began. That's not a mistake. That's a business model. And it worked because the prescription gave it legitimacy. These weren't street drugs. These were medicine prescribed by professionals, picked up at clean pharmacies in suburban strip malls. The trap wasn't just pharmaceutical. It was cultural. It was the belief that anything a doctor prescribes must be safe, that corporations wouldn't poison their own customers, that the system existed to protect rather than profit. By the time the truth became undeniable, millions were already caught. And unlike heroin, which could be demonized as a street drug used by moral failures, OxyContin had been taken by soccer moms, veterans, grandparents, children recovering from wisdom teeth removal. The crisis couldn't be silenced through stigma because it had infiltrated demographics that society couldn't dismiss. The response was predictable. Purdue faced lawsuits, paid billions in settlements, declared bankruptcy. But the damage, that had already metastasized. Because when the prescriptions dried up, when doctors got scared and stopped writing for opioids, the millions who were already addicted didn't just recover. They found alternatives. And those alternatives were waiting, cheaper and stronger than anything Purdue had ever created. The trap had sprung, and the next chapter was already being written in powder and needles. The bridge appeared overnight, but it had been building for years. When doctors stopped prescribing OxyContin as freely, when pharmacies started flagging repeat customers, when the legal supply tightened into a chokehold, addiction didn't stop. It just changed addresses. People who'd never imagined themselves as drug users found themselves in parking lots, in strange apartments, in places where pills were sold without prescriptions and questions weren't welcome. The transition felt like necessity, not choice. And for many, It began with a simple economic calculation. A single OxyContin pill on the street cost $30. Heroin cost $10. The math was brutal. The wound was already open. What nobody predicted was how seamlessly the infrastructure would adapt. The same desperation that made people seek pills made them willing to try powder. Dealers recognized the opportunity before public health officials even understood what was happening. They targeted suburban areas where opioid prescriptions had been highest, places where addiction had been classified as medical until the prescriptions ran out. Then it became criminal. But the body doesn't care about classifications. The body only knows withdrawal, that specific agony that erases dignity and replaces it with singular focus. Make it stop. Heroin made it stop. And once that bridge was crossed, once the needle replaced the pill bottle, the truth became undeniable. This wasn't about morality anymore. It never had been. The bridge wasn't just pharmaceutical, it was psychological. Pills had carried legitimacy. They came from doctors. They had brand names. They were swallowed like vitamins. Heroin carried stigma. It represented a line that respectable people didn't cross. But addiction has a way of erasing lines. When withdrawal hits, when the shaking starts and the world narrows to a single need, stigma becomes irrelevant. The first time someone uses heroin, they tell themselves it's temporary, just until they can get back to pills, just until things stabilize, just this once. But heroin doesn't do temporary, it does permanent. And the bridge, once crossed, doesn't lead back. It only leads forward into a terrain where the rules are different, and survival depends on substances that were hidden from view until desperation made them visible. The operation happened in reverse. Instead of pharmaceutical companies pushing drugs into communities, communities were pulling drugs in to fill the void left by restricted prescriptions. The demand created the supply, and the supply? It came from cartels who'd been waiting for exactly this moment, who'd watched the prescription crisis build and prepared for the inevitable collapse. They flooded markets with heroin that was cheaper, purer, and more accessible than anything available through legal channels. The bridge wasn't built by policy or planning. It was built by pain meeting profit, by bodies in withdrawal meeting suppliers who understood that addiction doesn't discriminate. It just consumes, and it was consuming an entire generation. By 2015, heroin use had tripled among young adults. Overdose deaths were climbing exponentially, not just in cities but in small towns where everyone knew everyone, and the shock of loss was personal. The bridge had become a highway, and on that highway, something else was traveling, something stronger than heroin, something synthesized in labs that didn't care about dosage or safety. The pills had been the gateway, heroin had been the bridge. But what came next wasn't evolution, it was revolution. A synthetic storm was gathering, and it would make everything that came before look almost quaint by comparison. The truth was about to get silenced under the weight of numbers too large to comprehend. Fentanyl wasn't supposed to be a street drug. It was developed in 1959 as a surgical anesthetic, something so potent that micrograms could put a body under in seconds. Medical fentanyl is controlled, measured, administered by professionals in environments where overdose can be reversed instantly. Street fentanyl is none of those things. It's mixed in clandestine labs, cut into heroin by dealers who lack chemistry degrees, pressed into counterfeit pills that look pharmaceutical but contain pure lethality. The cartels saw an opportunity where corporations saw liability. They didn't need FDA approval or marketing campaigns. They just needed demand. And America, wounded and desperate, had demand to spare. The synthetic coup happened because fentanyl solved problems heroin couldn't. It's 50 times stronger than heroin, which means smaller quantities produce bigger profits. It's easier to smuggle. A kilogram of fentanyl powder fits in a backpack and supplies thousands of doses. And it's cheaper to produce, synthesized from precursor chemicals, shipped legally from factories overseas, transformed in Mexican labs into a substance that would collapse entire communities. The cartels didn't invent addiction. They just industrialized it, turned suffering into a supply chain efficient enough to compete with any Fortune 500 operation. This wasn't crime. This was capitalism unbound by regulation, ethics, or consequence. What made fentanyl different wasn't just potency, it was unpredictability. Heroin users developed tolerance, learned their limits, understood the signals their bodies sent. Fentanyl erased those signals. A dose that worked yesterday could kill today because batches varied, mixtures changed, and the margin between high and death was measured in grains of powder invisible to the naked eye. Overdoses spiked not because users were reckless, but because the drug itself had become a game of Russian roulette. The truth was hidden in the inconsistency. Every hit was a gamble, every needle a potential execution. And the people using it? They weren't choosing death. They were choosing relief from withdrawal so severe that the risk seemed worth it. The operation was global, but the impact was local. Small towns in Ohio, West Virginia, Kentucky, places that had been gutted by the prescription crisis, now faced something worse. Fentanyl didn't care about geography or demographics. It killed grandmothers, teenagers, veterans, people who thought they were taking Xanax or Percocet and ended up with counterfeit pills laced with enough fentanyl to stop a heart. Emergency responders carried Narcan by the case, reviving the same people multiple times a week because treatment beds were full, because policy moved slower than the crisis, because society had decided this was a criminal problem when it had always been a humanitarian collapse. The wound deepened with every death that could have been prevented but wasn't. By 2020, fentanyl was responsible for more overdose deaths than heroin and prescription opioids combined. The cartels had finished what Purdue started, completed the arc from medical miracle to street nightmare with ruthless efficiency. They'd turned addiction into an assembly line, suffering into market share, death into a numbers game where profit margins mattered more than body counts. And the classified reports governments finally began taking seriously revealed a terrifying truth. The synthetic coup wasn't ending. It was evolving. New analogues were appearing, carfentanil, nitazines, compounds so powerful they required hazmat suits to handle safely. The war had shifted terrain once again, and this time, the enemy wasn't a corporation that could be sued or a plant that could be eradicated. It was chemistry itself, adaptable and relentless, always one formula ahead of enforcement. Before 1914, addiction wasn't illegal. It was tragic perhaps or unfortunate, but it wasn't criminal. A person could walk into a pharmacy and purchase morphine, cocaine, heroin without subterfuge or shame. Then came the Harrison Narcotic Tax Act, a piece of legislation that would reshape American drug policy for the next century. On paper, it was a tax law, a regulatory measure requiring doctors and pharmacists to register and pay fees for dispensing opiates. In practice, it criminalized addiction overnight. The law didn't say users were criminals, but it made maintaining their addiction through legal channels nearly impossible. What had been a medical issue became, through legislative alchemy, a moral failure punishable by imprisonment. The truth was encoded in legalese. Society had decided some suffering was acceptable as long as it was hidden. The Harrison Act passed during a moment of cultural panic, when immigration fears and racial anxieties were projected onto drug use. Chinese immigrants were associated with opium. Black Americans were falsely linked to cocaine-fueled violence. Mexican immigrants became targets during marijuana prohibition debates that would come later. The language of drug control has always been the language of control itself, not of substances, but of populations deemed threatening. Heroin and morphine addiction was widespread among white middle-class Americans, but the law wasn't framed as protecting them. It was framed as protecting society from them. The wound wasn't just chemical anymore. It was social, carved along lines of race and class, determining who received treatment and who received handcuffs. What made the Harrison Act devastating wasn't its stated purpose, but its unintended consequences. Doctors who prescribed opiates to maintain addicted patients were prosecuted, imprisoned, had their licenses revoked. The medical establishment, terrified of legal repercussions, abandoned patients en masse. People who'd been receiving morphine or heroin through legitimate medical channels suddenly had nowhere to turn. The supply didn't disappear, it just went underground. Black markets emerged instantly, filling the void with unregulated substances that were cheaper, more dangerous, and completely divorced from medical oversight. The law had intended to eliminate addiction through prohibition. Instead, it created the conditions for organized crime to flourish. The operation was complete. Medicine had become crime, and crime had become business. The Act also established a precedent that would echo through decades of drug policy. The belief that punishment could cure addiction. It couldn't. It never has. But the framework stuck because it allowed society to distance itself from the problem. If addiction was criminal, it didn't require compassion or healthcare investment. It required jails. And jails filled quickly with people whose only crime was being unable to stop using substances their bodies had been conditioned to need. The classified medical literature of the era shows doctors understood this, documented it, argued against criminalization. They were silenced by politics, by moral crusaders who believed sobriety could be legislated, by economic interests that profited from prohibition. The truth became inconvenient, so it was erased from policy discussions. By 1920, the landscape had transformed completely. What had been a public health crisis became a criminal justice problem. What had been treatment became incarceration. And the people caught in between. They became statistics, cautionary tales, evidence that the law was working because arrests were rising. Never mind that addiction rates weren't falling, that overdoses were increasing, that the human cost was being measured in broken families and wasted lives. The Harrison Act didn't solve addiction. It just changed where it happened and who profited from it. The pharmaceutical companies had been replaced by criminal enterprises. The doctors had been replaced by dealers. And the wound, that had only deepened, infected now with stigma that would make healing exponentially harder for the next century. The law had drawn a line, and on the other side of that line, an empire was already rising. Marseille in the 1930s wasn't just a port city. It was a gateway, a place where geography and criminality converged to create something unprecedented. Turkish opium arrived by ship, raw and legal under international agreements that allowed medicinal production. French chemists, many trained in legitimate pharmaceutical labs, transformed that opium into heroin with industrial precision. The product then traveled to America through networks so sophisticated they operated like multinational corporations. This wasn't street-level dealing. This was the French Connection, the first true heroin superstructure, a criminal operation that proved prohibition didn't eliminate supply. It just made supply more profitable and more organized. The system worked because everyone involved had plausible deniability. Turkish farmers grew poppies for legal morphine production. French labs claimed pharmaceutical purposes. Corsican crime families handled logistics with the efficiency of shipping companies. And American mobsters distributed the product through networks built during alcohol prohibition. Infrastructure already in place and waiting for the next illicit commodity. The heroin traveled hidden in cargo shipments, in false-bottomed suitcases, in the bodies of couriers who swallowed balloons filled with powder and hoped their stomachs didn't rupture mid-flight. The truth was hidden in plain sight, moving through legitimate trade routes, disguised as legal commerce until it reached streets where legality no longer mattered. What made the French Connection unstoppable for decades wasn't secrecy, it was scale. By the 1960s, they were supplying an estimated 95% of America's heroin. That's not a criminal enterprise, that's a monopoly. The operation was so entrenched that busting individual dealers meant nothing. The pipeline remained intact, constantly adapting, replacing arrested members with new recruits who understood the business model, high risk, higher reward, and a customer base that couldn't stop buying, no matter how many enforcement operations tried to cut supply. Law enforcement was playing checkers. The French Connection was playing chess, always 3 moves ahead, always willing to sacrifice pawns to protect the king. The wound the French Connection carved wasn't just in America. It was in every port city along the route, every community touched by the transit. Marseille became synonymous with organized crime. Corsican families gained power that rivaled governments. Turkish farmers became dependent on opium revenue. And America watched its inner cities collapse under the weight of addiction that arrived in waves, each shipment feeding thousands of dependencies that created demand for the next shipment. The cycle was self-sustaining, a closed loop of supply meeting demand, meeting profit meeting more supply. The classified intelligence reports knew the routes, knew the players, but knowing and stopping were different operations entirely. The French Connection finally collapsed in the early 1970s. Not through law enforcement brilliance, but through political pressure and lucky breaks. A massive bust in 1962. French government crackdowns following international embarrassment. Turkey agreeing to ban opium cultivation in exchange for American aid. But collapse didn't mean elimination. It meant evolution. The heroin didn't stop flowing. It just changed routes. The Golden Triangle was already waiting, fields of poppies blooming in Southeast Asia, where war and chaos created perfect conditions for the next superstructure to rise. The French Connection had been the blueprint. What came next would be the empire, and the truth, as always, would be erased beneath layers of geopolitics too complex for headlines to capture. The Golden Triangle wasn't built. It emerged, born from the collision of war, geography, and opportunity in the mountains where Thailand, Laos, and Myanmar meet. For centuries, hill tribes had cultivated opium for local use and regional trade. Then came the Cold War, and suddenly those remote valleys became strategic assets. The CIA needed allies to fight communist insurgencies. Warlords needed money to fund their armies. And opium. Opium was currency, more stable than any government, more valuable than gold in regions where infrastructure didn't exist and banks were luxuries. The arrangement was never officially acknowledged, but it didn't need to be. The operation was perfect in its simplicity. Turn a blind eye, let the heroin flow, and call it geopolitics. By the 1960s, the Golden Triangle was producing 70% of the world's illicit opium. The logistics were staggering. Fields hidden in terrain so mountainous that enforcement was nearly impossible. labs operated by chemists trained by remnants of the Kuomintang Chinese forces who'd fled Mao's revolution, smuggling routes protected by private armies that controlled territory better than any national government could. This wasn't crime hiding in shadows. This was a parallel economy operating in full daylight, so entrenched that attacking it would have destabilized the entire region. And America, deep in the Vietnam War, couldn't afford instability, so the heroin flowed south through Thailand, east through Laos, into Vietnam, where American soldiers waited, already wounded in ways that had nothing to do with combat. The truth about Vietnam and heroin is one history prefers to keep classified. Estimates suggest 15% of American servicemen used heroin regularly during the war. Not because they were weak or immoral, but because the drug was everywhere, purer and cheaper than anything available stateside, and because the psychological wounds of guerrilla warfare required medication that the military wasn't providing. Soldiers came home addicted, returned to communities unprepared for the scale of the problem, and found themselves criminalized rather than treated. The Golden Triangle had exported more than heroin. It had exported a crisis that would define American drug policy for decades. And the warlords who enabled it, they remained in power, protected by the same geopolitical calculations that had allowed the operation to flourish in the first place. What made the Golden Triangle different from the French connection was its durability. The French pipeline had choke points, ports, labs, networks that could be disrupted. The Golden Triangle was decentralized, embedded in terrain that swallowed enforcement operations whole. Warlords like Kun Sa operated with impunity, controlling private armies, negotiating with governments, running what was essentially a narco-state within states too weak to challenge him. His empire produced hundreds of tons of heroin annually, generated billions in revenue, and proved that prohibition created power vacuums, filled by whoever was ruthless and organized enough to exploit them. The wound wasn't just in the bodies that consumed the product. It was in the geopolitical structure that protected production, because dismantling it would require admitting complicity. By the 1990s, the Golden Triangle's dominance was waning, challenged by Afghanistan's rising production and synthetic alternatives that required no poppy fields. But the empire it built didn't collapse. It adapted, diversified into methamphetamine production, maintained smuggling networks that could move any illicit commodity. The infrastructure remained, waiting for the next opportunity, the next crisis, the next moment when demand would spike and supply would be there to meet it. The Golden Triangle had proven something fundamental. Prohibition doesn't stop drug production. It just determines who profits and where production happens. And somewhere, in mountains still beyond the reach of law, fields of poppies continue to bloom, hidden from view but never truly erased. The next chapter was already being written in Afghan soil, where war would once again create the perfect conditions for heroin to thrive. Afghanistan's relationship with opium is older than any empire that tried to control it. For centuries, farmers cultivated poppies in soil too poor for much else, sold the resin for medicine and trade, maintained a balance between subsistence and profit. Then came invasion after invasion. The Soviets in 1979, the Americans in 2001. And that balance shattered. War doesn't just destroy infrastructure, it creates economic vacuums. And in Afghanistan, opium filled that vacuum so completely that it became the country's primary revenue source, funding the Taliban, corrupting the government, and transforming a struggling agricultural economy into the world's largest heroin producer. The truth was never hidden. It was just inconvenient to address while fighting wars that depended on local cooperation. the Taliban's relationship with opium is complicated in ways policy papers can't capture. Before 2001, they'd banned cultivation, slashing production by 90% in a single year through brutal enforcement. Then came the American invasion, the collapse of their government, and the need to fund an insurgency against the most powerful military on earth. Opium became their bank, generating billions annually through taxes on farmers, lab protection fees, and smuggling operations. They didn't need banks or international support. They had fields that produced 3 harvests a year and a customer base that spanned continents. The operation was classified as terrorism financing, but it looked more like agribusiness. And the American military? They watched it happen, sometimes destroyed fields, sometimes didn't, caught between counter-narcotics goals and counter-insurgency needs that required not alienating the same farmers growing the poppies. By 2007, Afghanistan was producing 93% of the world's opium. That's not a statistic. That's a monopoly built on war, sustained by instability, protected by geography that makes enforcement nearly impossible. The heroin produced in Afghan labs traveled through Pakistan, Iran, Central Asia, eventually reaching Europe, Russia, and North America. The supply chain was so robust that interdiction efforts barely dented it. For every shipment seized, 10 more got through. For every lab destroyed, 3 more opened in valleys military forces couldn't reach without sparking firefights that would cost American lives for minimal strategic gain. The wound was geographical, carved into mountains where sovereignty meant little and survival meant everything. What made Afghanistan's heroin empire different was its integration with legitimate governance. Government officials, from local police to national ministers, took bribes to protect shipments, taxed production, invested profits into legal businesses that laundered money back into the economy. The line between state and cartel blurred until it disappeared entirely. And America, spending billions on reconstruction and counter-narcotics, found itself in the absurd position of funding a government whose officials were profiting from the same drug trade those funds were supposed to eliminate. The truth was documented in classified reports, discussed in secure briefings, and then systematically ignored because addressing it would require admitting the entire mission was compromised from the start. When America withdrew in 2021, leaving Afghanistan to the Taliban once again, the opium economy remained. The Taliban initially announced renewed bans, destroyed some fields for international credibility, but the economic reality hasn't changed. Opium is still the most profitable crop in a country with few alternatives. The infrastructure built over 20 years of war, the labs, the smuggling routes, the corruption networks, none of that disappeared with American departure. It just adapted, as it always has. Afghanistan proved what history keeps teaching, that prohibition during wartime doesn't stop drug production. It weaponizes it, turns agriculture into ammunition, transforms flowers into funding for conflicts that consume generations. And somewhere in those same mountains, poppies still bloom. Their harvest feeding an appetite that began with a German pharmaceutical company, and a lie the world chose to believe. The cycle continues, silenced by distance, and the comforting belief that it's someone else's problem now. The American Civil War introduced morphine to suffering on an industrial scale. Battlefield surgeons carried it in leather cases, administered it with primitive syringes to soldiers whose limbs had been shattered by Minié balls and cannon fire. There was no anesthesia for most procedures, no understanding of sterile technique, no concept of dosage limits. Pain was the enemy, and morphine was the only weapon that worked. Doctors injected it liberally, repeatedly, into men who screamed through amputations performed on wooden tables in tents that smelled of gangrene and death. The drug didn't just ease suffering, it erased it so completely that soldiers begged for it even after their wounds had healed. Nobody called it addiction yet. They called it soldier's disease, as if war itself was the pathology rather than the treatment. By the war's end in 1865, an estimated 400,000 veterans had developed dependencies on morphine. 400,000 men who returned to farms and factories and families, carrying a need that civilian doctors didn't know how to address. The wound wasn't just physical anymore, it was chemical, written into neural pathways that demanded the drug regardless of whether pain still existed. Patent medicines flooded the market to meet this demand, tonics and elixirs laced with morphine and cocaine, sold without regulation or honesty about their contents. The truth was hidden in vague labels promising relief from neuralgia, melancholy, women's troubles, anything that could justify the presence of opiates without calling them what they were. The Civil War had created America's first addiction epidemic, and the response was to sell more of what caused it. What made this moment historically significant wasn't just the scale of addiction. It was the collision of technology and chemistry. The hypodermic syringe, perfected in the 1850s, allowed drugs to bypass the digestive system and hit the bloodstream directly. This wasn't gradual relief. This was instant, overwhelming, undeniable. The needle changed everything. It made drugs more effective and more addictive, created a ritual that became inseparable from the high itself. Veterans who'd been injected with morphine on battlefields continued seeking injections afterward, not just for the chemical, but for the entire experience, the puncture, the warmth spreading through veins, the moment between consciousness and oblivion. The operation had been medicalized, but the result was anything but medical. The classified military records from the era, the ones that documented addiction rates among returning soldiers, reveal something uncomfortable. Commanders knew. Surgeons knew. The problem was discussed in medical journals, debated in veteran hospitals, acknowledged in private correspondence. But publicly, silence prevailed. Admitting the scale of morphine addiction would have required acknowledging that the war had wounded soldiers in ways that wouldn't heal, that the government had created dependencies it had no infrastructure to treat, that victory had come with costs that couldn't be calculated in casualty lists alone. So the truth was buried in bureaucratic language, erased from official narratives, left for individual veterans and their families to manage in shame and isolation. The Civil War established a pattern that would repeat through every American conflict that followed. World War I soldiers returned addicted to morphine and heroin. Vietnam veterans came home hooked on heroin so pure it changed the trajectory of American drug policy. Iraq and Afghanistan produced a generation dependent on prescription opioids prescribed for combat injuries and PTSD. War doesn't just create physical casualties, it creates pharmaceutical ones, turns pain management into a pathway for addiction that policy refuses to address because addressing it would mean confronting uncomfortable truths about what we ask soldiers to endure and what we give them to survive it. The needle and the powder, first united on Civil War battlefields, remain linked through every conflict since, and the wound they created, that wound has never stopped bleeding, only changed location, moving from veteran hospitals to suburban homes, from morphine to OxyContin to fentanyl, always the same pattern dressed in different chemicals. The first alchemist who isolated morphine couldn't have imagined this legacy, but perhaps he should have. Friedrich Serturner was 21 years old when he accomplished what centuries of alchemists had failed to achieve. Working alone in a pharmacy in Paderborn, Germany in 1804, he isolated the active ingredient from opium, a crystalline alkaloid he named morphium after Morpheus, the Greek god of dreams. It was the first time anyone had extracted a pure drug from a plant, the birth of modern pharmacology, a discovery that should have earned him immediate acclaim. Instead, it earned him skepticism. The scientific establishment dismissed his work, questioned his methods, doubted that a pharmacist's apprentice could have unlocked something chemists had pursued for generations. The truth was too revolutionary to accept immediately. So it waited, hidden in obscure journals, until the world was desperate enough to believe it. Serturner didn't understand what he'd created. He tested morphine on himself and 3 friends, documenting euphoria, pain relief, and disturbing side effects, nausea, confusion, a sleep so deep it bordered on death. He'd discovered both the promise and the danger simultaneously, but his focus remained on the promise. Pain was humanity's oldest enemy, and he'd found a weapon that could defeat it absolutely. The wound his discovery would eventually inflict never occurred to him. Why would it? He was thinking in terms of relief, not dependency. He saw morphine as salvation, not the beginning of a cycle that would consume millions. The operation he initiated wasn't intentional. It was inevitable, the moment chemistry gave humanity power without wisdom to wield it responsibly. Recognition finally came in 1817, when Serturner published refined research that couldn't be ignored. The French pharmaceutical industry immediately began commercial production. Morphine spread through European medicine like revelation, solving problems that had plagued physicians since antiquity. Surgical procedures became survivable. Chronic pain became manageable. Diseases like dysentery and cholera, which killed through dehydration and agony, could be treated with something more effective than prayer. For 2 decades, morphine looked like pure progress, the miracle Serturner had promised. The addiction? That truth remained silenced by enthusiasm, by the sheer relief of having a tool that worked, by the belief that anything this effective must be fundamentally good. The first warnings appeared in the 1840s, observations from doctors treating patients who couldn't stop taking morphine even after their original ailments had healed. These reports were scattered, anecdotal, easily dismissed as isolated cases rather than systemic patterns. Serturner himself never fully grasped the implications of his discovery. He died in 1841, honored as a pioneer, unaware that his crystalline powder was already spreading addiction across continents, that his dream of ending suffering had created a different kind of suffering entirely. The classified medical literature of the era shows growing concern, but concern without framework. Addiction wasn't understood as a disease yet. It was understood as weakness, moral failure, something that happened to other people. By the time the truth became undeniable, morphine had embedded itself too deeply into medical practice to extract. Serturner's legacy is complicated in ways he never lived to see. He gave humanity one of the most important medical discoveries in history, pain relief that actually worked. But he also gave humanity the template for every opioid crisis that followed. The proof that isolating and concentrating natural compounds creates substances more powerful than nature intended, more addictive than the body can handle. Every pill, every injection, every overdose traces back to that moment in 1804, when a young pharmacist heated opium and watched crystals form, pure and white and beautiful. He thought he'd found a cure. He'd found a question that medicine still hasn't answered. How do you separate relief from dependency when the chemistry doesn't distinguish between them? The wound Serturner opened never healed. It just kept growing, fed by every discovery that made opioids stronger, every innovation that made addiction easier, every war and crisis and corporate decision that chose profit over caution. And somewhere in the foundation of it all, the first alchemist's dream of ending pain became the nightmare that would define centuries. The miracle was never real. But the consequences, those were always going to last forever. The story doesn't end. It never does. Every chapter that seemed like conclusion was just transition. Every solution became the next crisis. Every attempt to control addiction only changed its form. From Saturna's morphine to Bayer's heroin, from Purdue's OxyContin to cartel fentanyl, the pattern repeats with precision that feels almost intentional. But it's not conspiracy. It's something more mundane and more terrifying. It's the collision of human suffering with human greed, of bodies that feel pain with systems that profit from relief. The wound was never just chemical. It was structural, built into the architecture of how society addresses suffering, who deserves treatment and who deserves punishment. And that wound, it remains open, bleeding across generations, refusing to heal because healing would require honesty we're not willing to provide. The truth about opioids was never hidden. It was always documented in medical journals, in classified reports, in the testimonies of people whose bodies told stories that policy refused to hear. Sir Turner observed addiction in his own trials. Bayer received warnings about heroin before it flooded markets. Purdue had internal documents proving OxyContin's dangers. The information existed. What didn't exist was the will to act on it, to prioritize human welfare over pharmaceutical profit, to treat addiction as the medical crisis it always was, rather than the moral failure it was convenient to pretend. The silence wasn't enforced through conspiracy. It was enforced through cognitive dissonance, through the human capacity to ignore what's inconvenient, to believe what's profitable, to erase uncomfortable truths in favor of comfortable lies. What makes this history so devastating isn't just the body count, though that's staggering enough. Millions dead, tens of millions addicted, entire communities collapsed under the weight of a crisis that was always preventable. What makes it devastating is the repetition. We keep making the same mistakes with different molecules, keep believing the next pharmaceutical innovation will be different, keep criminalizing the victims while protecting the architects. The operation continues because the incentives haven't changed. Pain is still profitable. Addiction is still more lucrative than treatment. And society still prefers punishment to compassion, still finds it easier to build prisons than fund rehabilitation, still treats addiction as a character flaw rather than a predictable response to chemical dependency. The classified documents keep accumulating. New studies showing addiction potential, new warnings about synthetic opioids, new evidence that criminalization doesn't work, that harm reduction saves lives, that treating addiction as a public health crisis produces better outcomes than treating it as a crime. The information is there. It's always been there. But information without implementation is just paper, just words, just another buried truth in archives that future historians will read and wonder how we knew so much and did so little. The wound deepens not from ignorance, but from apathy, from the calculated decision that some lives matter less than others, that some suffering is acceptable as long as it's kept out of view, that the price of a miracle is worth paying as long as someone else pays it. The miracle was never real. It was marketing, hope misplaced in chemistry, the belief that relief without consequence was possible if only we found the right formula. But every formula carries a cost. Morphine cost morphine addiction. Heroin cost heroin epidemics. OxyContin cost a generation. Fentanyl costs dozens of lives daily. And the next synthetic opioid, whatever it is, will cost whatever we're willing to pay before finally admitting that the approach itself is broken. The story doesn't end because we keep writing the same chapter with different drugs, keep believing this time will be different. Keep prioritizing everything except the truth that's been visible since Sir Turner's first crystallization. Some wounds can't be medicated away. Some pain has to be faced, treated with honesty and care rather than chemicals and denial. Until that truth stops being silenced, the cycle continues. And the bodies? They just keep piling higher, monuments to miracles that were always lies. Sir Turner died believing he'd given humanity a gift. Bayer moved on to aspirin and never apologized. Purdue paid billions and declared bankruptcy, but the architects walked free. The cartels, they're still operating, adapting, synthesizing the next compound that will be 50 times stronger than the last. And the bodies keep accumulating, not because we don't know better, but because knowing has never been enough to change a system built on their suffering. The miracle promised relief without consequence. It promised progress without price. It promised that chemistry could solve what compassion wouldn't address. And for over 2 centuries, we've believed variations of that same lie, dressed in different molecules, marketed with different language, but always carrying the same hidden wound. The truth was never classified, it was just inconvenient. And inconvenient truths have a way of getting erased, not through conspiracy, but through collective agreement that some suffering is acceptable as long as it happens to someone else. History is written by those who survive. But the silenced? They leave marks too, in empty chairs at dinner tables, in children raised by grandparents because the middle generation collapsed, in communities that look like war zones though no bombs ever fell. The wound isn't just in the past, it's present, active, bleeding into a future we keep insisting will be different, while repeating every mistake that brought us here. The story doesn't end, because we refuse to write a different ending. And the price of that refusal? It's measured in lives we decided weren't worth the cost of honesty.